Hi, everybody. I would like to welcome you to this fireside chat. My name is Malte. I'm an associate partner with McKinsey and Company's logistics practice. And today I'm going to be discussing vaccine logistics and the COVID vaccine supply chain with Margi Van Gogh. Really excited to have you here, Margi, and maybe you can say a couple of words about yourself.
Thank you very much, Malte, and thank you to everybody that's taking the time to follow this conversation with us today. My name is Margi Van Gogh. I'm with the World Economic Forum and lead the the supply chain and transport industries practice, with a focus at the moment on the health sector, of course, given how challenging the pandemic is for all of us. Our mobility platform work typically focuses on accelerating a global transition to a safer, cleaner, and more inclusive transportation system. And when we think about this pandemic, inclusive really is the central focus here.
Great. So in the past weeks, I think we've heard a lot of scrutiny about the vaccine supply chain with these huge issues in production capacity, distribution capacity, cold chain. But maybe to kick us off, Margi, what has worked well? What were the successful things that you see?
So Malta, I think absolutely, the government response and the alignment between private and public sector has certainly given us some early gains. What I think is really interesting now is to also consider what some of the challenges and the constraints are that have been facing distribution and supply chain organizations as we consider how to respond. So perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts a little bit on that front.
Yeah, of course. So I think we are seeing some challenges that just originate in the huge spread of distribution that needs to happen across the world, pretty much across all countries. And that just in itself is a large supply chain task. What I think really makes this especially daunting is the temperature requirements that these new vaccines pose. So the minus 70 degrees is nothing that a logistics player typically does in large bulk volumes, because those types of temperature requirements are seen mainly in things like clinical trials at much lower volumes. So we are talking about a global supply chain at temperature requirements that are far from usual. In addition, the pandemic obviously also affects capacity. We have significant shortages when it comes to air freight capacity, mainly because typically a lot of air freight loads are transported as part of passenger flights, and those are grounded. And on the other hand, ocean cargo rates have increased drastically, sometimes fourfold, and we now have a capacity constraint also on the container side. While the vaccines are largely being transported via air freight, all of the peripherals like syringes are being transported via sea. And trying to create a supply chain where both of these items now arrive in every single country in the world at the same time is just an extremely daunting task. In addition, outside the temperatures and outside the transport especially, we see that production capacity is still an issue. This was expected last year, but at least here in Europe, it seems to be facing increasing scrutiny from the media. We hope that this will become better over time. We still have some, I would call them teething troubles when it comes to the interface between patients and the government in scheduling their appointments. The apps are not running perfectly everywhere. Phone lines are crowded. So I would call this the sort of standard issues that you face when you set up an operation like this, and we really hope that this improves over the coming months. Then we have everything that is related to really the last mile. So while we have found ways on the logistics side to come from the production facilities into the countries, the last mile to the patient is obviously also quite challenging. Many countries have taken the route of centralized vaccination points, which makes sense due to the low temperature requirements. But at the same time, some of the key risk groups are less mobile. So elderly patients that can't really leave their care homes anymore also need to be vaccinated. And that's a challenge that a lot of countries face, trying to put together a last mile with those stringent temperature requirements to also cater to their patients most at risk. And then finally, on the digital side, I would say is the tracking of the whole thing. So we have the physical flow and the tracking of temperatures, the trackings of locations to just make sure that those stringent temperature requirements are being met and met consistently. And also that issues like counterfeit vaccines don't make it to the customer yet.
Sorry, I was just going to say, as a litany of challenges there, I mean, they're significant. And then have you got any thoughts on, the reverse logistics challenges insofar as, we talk about return packaging and impact on environment? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that is, I think it's a challenge that currently is kind of taking a back seat in the minds of many, because countries are trying to just distribute the vaccines as quickly as possible, and understandably so. However, when you look at the packaging requirements that, for example, the -70 degrees shipping brings with different types of containers and different types of temperature loggers and batteries and dry ice, there's a significant sustainability topic that needs to be addressed in the midterm. Meaning, how do we get those containers back? How do we reuse them? How do we make sure that the syringes and needles get disposed of properly or recycled, in order to make sure that we try and keep the environmental impact of this large-scale campaign limited as much as possible.
So I'll just follow up with a question to on the back of the last mile comment and the reverse logistics then. So Malte, what typical supply chain setups are you then seeing being used in order to deliver these vaccines into various countries? The World Economic Forum is working very actively with UNICEF in terms of being able to determine how the supply chain and transport broader community can support this. But what are you seeing as typical here? And are there advantages and disadvantages from your vantage point?
Yeah, I think right now we are seeing two main, very basic archetypes. One is, I would call that something like express logistics, where we really have a logistics from the point of production to the point of use in the individual countries by plane, small quantities, very tailored, very clearly tracked and closely monitored, and also expensive, obviously, on a per kilogram basis, if you will. So real express logistics. This is also due to the fact that the -70 degree, again, really prohibits a lot of mistakes along the supply chain. So using real express logistics until the point of use seems to be most reliable when it comes to that. Obviously, as we know it from other parts of the medical supply chain, we believe that for larger countries, it does make sense to start looking at storage and buffering within the country or within the region. So a warehousing solution, and then doing the last mile from a warehouse, which allows you to create sort of a buffer in the supply chain rather than having everything done in an express fashion, and should also enable some cost reductions in the midterm. However, for now, the main thing that we see is really for the -70 degrees express logistics path. But how do you, from your work, especially also with the less industrialized countries, Margi, how do you see that those supply chain setups and also the associated challenges differ between what we see in the more industrialized countries?
Well, this is a focus, Malte, for us for the last number of months, actually, looking at inclusivity and how can we, at the forum, through our mobility and supply chain communities, but also specifically through the health communities, support COVAX, which has been widely reported on. If we have a look at industrial economies and the industrialized nations and large corporations, a significant greater capability to facilitate procurement independent of any sort of collective buying structures that get put in place, where we see this role being filled by non-governmental organizations such as, Gavi and COVAX coming together with a distribution foreseen through UNICEF. This is one of the challenges on the procurement side. As far as distribution is concerned, and as far as planning for distribution on the ground is concerned, once these doses become available for those countries in the global south, one can look at the challenges just in the global south of temperature, right, and the impact that has on cold chain and on maintaining cold chain, and therefore the importance of a fully functional electricity and power infrastructure. And one of the challenges that we faced with in South Africa at the moment is extreme load on our grid, on our power grid. And one only has to think that every day that there's load shedding in one of these countries, the impact that might have if the generator system that supports, as a backup is not functioning correctly. So when one is looking at, minus 70 degrees, that is intense and extreme and unlikely that those vaccines are going to be made widely available in the global south, just due to infrastructure capability. But even when one's looking at 2 to 8 degrees in very hot locations, this presents an extreme challenge. On the transport side, we know that road networks are not necessarily as well developed, that you have widely dispersed rural populations. Communication is not as fluid as it is certainly in the industrialized world. And therefore, just scheduling appointments, if one's looking at how to get the tip of the needle into the arm, really requires strong private, public, and NGO collaboration. And another key challenge, and certainly I think this, irrespective of which part of the globe you're in, global north or the global south, there is a strong debate at the moment about the security around these vaccines. Are they going to arrive safe? In other words, the cold chain has not been broken. Are they going to be counterfeit? Are they protected from theft? This is sometimes much harder to secure in less developed countries, and of course where the demand is very great. And I think this is something that we certainly need to consider, along with, I imagine, what some of the challenges are that we expect to overcome in the coming few months. So I think here, I guess I'd like to put to you the question of, how do you expect to see those challenges unfolding in the next few months? Where do you expect to see focus and investment? And what do you think specifically in terms of priority the private sector can contribute from your perspective and engagement widely in the private and state sector? How do you see us overcoming some of those challenges, Malte?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really hope that a lot of these challenges can be overcome. I know that some of the ones that you mentioned, like insufficient roads or power supply, are topics and challenges that we've seen for a long time. So we would have to see how the right logistic solutions may be able to alleviate some of them. But a lot of the other topics I currently also see as just the signs that this is a really new thing for all of the players in the market. So, for example, on the countryside, I doubt that countries, at least in the past couple of years, have taken such a pronounced role in procuring such a vast quantity of services from the private sector in logistics and in pharma. So obviously, one of the positive aspects that you mentioned at the beginning, this agile sort of entrepreneurial spirit to come up with the solutions to try and help the population as best as possible, it also comes with the risk that not all the solutions will be optimal. So it's going to take some months before companies learn from each other's mistake, I believe, and then also the supply chain setups kind of maybe convert to what the countries see as optimal. I also think that this whole topic around the customer interface, getting meetings, getting the vaccination scheduled, making sure you have somebody on the phone who can answer your questions, I think those are things that will also sort of groove in and become better over time. And here's also where I do believe that the private sector can add value, because there are companies with a lot of expertise in building the kind of digital backbones that you need to make an efficient, to make appointment scheduling efficient and effective at the same time. So I think that's where private sector and public sector need to work together to come up with a solution that really works for the public. As for the temperature requirements, we are already seeing today that some of those temperature requirements are being alleviated. Some of the newer players that have come into the market with a vaccine are requiring temperature regimens that are less stringent. And we do hope that this improves over time, so that on the one hand, the countries that you said before that will have a very, very hard time working with the minus 70 degree supply chain have a better chance of securing vaccines for their populations. And on the other hand, it just alleviates some of the pressure from the supply chains that just comes with this extreme temperature requirement and this extreme cold chain requirement that really leaves hardly any room for mistakes. And then finally, I think one of the things that we've seen work well, and you said that in the beginning, is this co-opetition theme, right? What we are seeing in the different sectors is that we see competitors cooperate on this topic, and to me, this can really unlock a lot of different things. Whether it's the Pfizer-BioNTech in the development and testing of the vaccine, whether it's I think Sanofi that is supporting in the production of the vaccine. These types of collaborations, at least for a limited scope and a limited period of time, can really help us globally to improve the logistics performance and to increase our chances of really beating this virus through widespread vaccinations.
Malte, I just want to pick up on that last point, and I think that it's absolutely vital when one looks at the significant opportunity that we have to prepare not only for the rollout of this vaccine and learn from countries that are rolling it out in advance of those who need it in the global south, but this co-opetition is going to be necessary in order to ensure that the global south does not get left behind. And whether that is in vaccine allocation and the funding necessary to support that. So in other words, where we have countries that we have seen acquire doses well in excess of those that would be needed by their population, are they prepared to donate those? Or whether we see co-opetition between logistics providers with mixed infrastructures in countries where you might have a need for a very strong warehousing capacity that may not exist with the provider that's got the transport, that you'd actually see a warehousing provider align themselves with the transport provider and start to look at how can we provide an end-to-end solution through collaboration and co-opetition. And of course, all of that lends itself to the need for visibility end-to-end. And I think this is where data collaboration comes into play. When we start to think about agility and what enables agility and therefore resilience, this is actually visibility. And visibility requires data sharing, elements of data being shared, not dissimilar to what we've seen in the discovery process, but also then in the distribution process. So I think there's significant room for greater levels of collaboration when it comes to end-to-end solutions with the visibility that allows end-to-end to be measured, whether that's in cold chain monitoring, whether it is in last mile distribution, or whether it is in fact in reducing some of the bottlenecks that occur as a result of this pandemic. And I think that is pretty vital, this collaborative spirit that is required.
I fully agree with you. And I fully stand behind the notion that I do think that the private sector, but also the industrialized economies need to stand together to also support the global south in getting these vaccines. We can't come to a scenario where the more industrialized and richer countries are getting the vaccines and it becomes harder and harder for the global south to do so as well. So this was really, really exciting conversation with you. You have some great perspectives on the topics, obviously, Margi, and I really thank you for taking the time and talking to me today. So I hope everybody was able to enjoy this discussion and get maybe some new thoughts on the topic. Thanks, everybody.
Most welcome. Thank you, Malte. Thank you, everybody.